All right, welcome everybody. My name is Julie Moody Freeman, and I am the director for the Center for Black Diaspora. This event is co-organized by the Center for Black Diaspora at DePaul University and by the International Association for the Study of Popular Romance. I'd like to thank Eric Sellinger, the president of what we call the organization YESPER, for co-organizing with us. Thanks so much to Dr. Margo Hendricks for agreeing to this masterclass. In the fall, she came and she did a masterclass on romance, on Black romance, and the attendees were calling, "We want more, we want more." Nobody wanted to leave. So I was able to get Dr. Hendricks again to come back and talk about, it's a little selfish. This is our favorite book. So this is why we are having it. So we are having, this is why we're doing this. So a big shout out to all of you who have zoomed in to be with us. We are just so grateful that you've taken your time to be here. Just a minute. Let me enable live transcriptions for you. All right. It should be available for you now. All right. So a quick thank you to the CBD, well, the Center for Black Diaspora staff. I could not have done this by myself. Um, when I hired Jessica Williams and Jennifer Ogwumike, their title says student assistants, but they are more than that to me. They're coordinators. They're just everything. They're my backup. They're my everything. And so Jessica Williams, who is a master's student in women's and gender studies and has graduated with her BA in psychology and minor in African and Black diaspora studies, and Jennifer Ogwumike, who is a senior in psychology with a minor in African and Black diaspora studies. Shout out to you all. You're everything to me. I'd also like to thank Catherine Douglas, who is the Assistant Director for the Center for Black Diaspora. Um, Now, our program, a little about our program. This program would not have been possible without Beverly Jenkins, who wrote Indigo. So before I introduce you to Margo, I would like to begin by sharing a short clip from an interview that I conducted with Beverly Jenkins about Indigo, and I did this on the Black Romance podcast. So let me attempt to share this with you. The link is also in the chat. All right, I've got sound optimized. Here we go. Let me know if you can't hear it, okay?
Yeah, maybe dive into Indigo a little.
Okay.
How that book came. That I love that book so much. How did it come about, Galen? Where did Galen come from? Where did Hester come from?
Hester came from Julie Dash. I'd seen Daughters of the Dust
Yes.
back when it first came out, and those purple hands really intrigued me.
Yes.
And in fact, Indigo was supposed to be the second book, but Vivid with her sassy self was like, "I'm not waiting." So, and Hester was like, "Okay, let's do it," So, but I kept telling Vivian, I have this story about this woman with these purple hands. And so it came directly from Daughters of the Dust. Sometimes you don't know where your influences will come from.
Right.
And so that was the influence for Hester.
Uh-huh.
And then I knew she would be in the Sea Islands because, basically that's where, Daughters of the Dust takes place.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember correctly, it's been a while. So I did the history and I did the research.
Mm-hmm.
And, I spent 7 or 8 years as the head clerk of the graduate library at Michigan State University. So researching stuff is very, very easy for me. And I tell people my mother was Black before it was fashionable. And I grew up with African American history in the home.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole career sort of is like a byproduct of the way I was raised and from working in the library. Michigan State University had a full set of the Journal of Negro History when I was working there in the mid 70s until the early 80s. And I would take handfuls of those out on the Red Cedar River, which runs through campus, for my lunch hour and just look through them because I was intrigued by the history. Little did I know that back then I was preparing for the life that I have now, because some of the stuff I go, oh, okay, I remember that from.
Yeah.
Okay. So all of that and Daughters of the Dust went together to make. And then I set it in Michigan because Michigan was has a great history for the Underground Railroad. A lot of the cities had code names, and Detroit is called Midnight because most of the freed, escaped people would show up at midnight. Well, they wouldn't show up at midnight, but they would take them across the river to Canada at midnight because it was dark. If you've ever been to Detroit and you stand on, downtown, Canada's right there. It's right across the river.
Okay.
It's Ontario, Windsor, Ontario. So you can see how, not necessarily how easy it was, but how convenient it was for. So I set Hester. Hester. My women are getting confused. Too many books, too many characters, girl. I set her in the area right here near me because there was a black township back then. Whitaker, Michigan.
Whitaker, okay.
Whitaker, Michigan, which is what is in the book. It's still here. It's not all black anymore now. And, it's mostly developed farmlands, farm and all that. So I set her here. And Galen is he's like the over-the-top romance hero with a purpose. There were men who went in and stole slaves and brought them north. So I wanted to make him that. That let me tell the history of that side of slavery.
Yes.
It let me tell history of the order in Detroit, with the coded handshakes and the coded cities and all of that. Yeah. Like I said, every character, especially in my older books, represented an aspect of African American history. So Galen represents that. He also represents the Jean de Couleur of Louisiana, the rich, wealthy, free Black. They were free, but they couldn't vote, so they weren't that free. So he represents a lot of different aspects of African American history. But he also represents, the ideal, oh my God, romance hero.
All I can remember, all the negligees.
Yeah, the negligees and him buying her oranges and
yes,
he was over the top.
He loved her. He loved her.
He loved her.
Purple hair.
Oh God, he loved her to death. Yes, he did. And and it was really interesting because Hester's very dark skinned.
Yes.
And when I did touring that year for that book, there were women in line weeping because very few of them had ever seen themselves portrayed as beautiful.
Yes.
In literature. And they're crying and I'm crying and the booksellers are crying. We're all just weeping. And it was a remarkable experience.
Yes. And
I didn't write it with that in mind. I wrote it because Black women come in so many different shades and colors and, so if you're going to represent, you're going to represent everybody. You're not going to represent just the Halle Berrys of the world.
Right.
So I can, it was moving. It was very, very, very moving.
Those are the beautiful words of Beverly Jenkins. Has me weepy. So I'd like to introduce Margo Hendricks, who is Professor Emerita of UC Santa Cruz, a recipient of a 2020 to 2021 Folger Library Fellowship. She's received a number of academic grants and fellowships to support her writing. She's a co-editor with Patricia Parker of Women, Race and Writing in the Early Modern Period, 1994. And Margo has published essays on Shakespeare, pre-modern critical race, early modern women, and whatever strikes her fancy. Her book, Race and Romance, Coloring the Past, is forthcoming in June 2022. And as you will see throughout her talk, that's the cover behind her. She has essays on Black romance in Black Love Matters, edited by Jessica P. Pride. As a matter of fact, Beverly Jenkins also has a chapter in Black Love Matters, and we'll put the link in the chat for you. And she and I are editing. Actually, we've finished editing. The work is done for the Black Romance special issue that will come out in the Journal of Popular Romance Studies. Behind the pen name Margo Hendricks is, no. The pen name behind Margo Hendricks is Elizabeth Grace. She's the author of the Daughters of Saria series and Midsummer Sisters, a Black Romance Contemporary series. And that the links to those will also be in the chat. So you came here to see Dr. Margo Hendricks. I'll pass you over to her. Welcome, Margo.
Thank you, Julie. I actually probably should just walk away because Ms. Jenkins said it all. Everything that I would say about this book, she said. I need you to understand, I've reread this book in the last 3 weeks, at least 3 times. And I was going to do it again last night, and I thought I better go to sleep because I'll be up till 6 and y'all wouldn't see me. So I want to thank Julie for allowing me to ride shotgun. And if you know what that means, you know what that means. You'll learn in a minute, but I just want to thank you so much. And I want to thank the Center for supporting this project on Black romance, because it's been around for centuries. And we like to pretend that it's just been invented, and it's not a new thing. So I'm going to jump into this because I got 1,845 words looking at me on my iPad that I want to get through and also leave time for questions. So first slide, please. Okay. That phrase, these purple hands intrigue me, seems so simple, but say so much about Indigo. It also speaks to me, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, why Black romance, and then we'll actually get into the book. I'm a lit professor by training, so if you want history, you're going to have to find someone else, even though I do a lot of historical stuff. I value the close reading with a smidge of historical materialism, mostly from reading Caribbean Black Marxism with a pinch of cultural materialism, mostly English and Black diasporic English folk, a large smattering of Black feminism, and all of these swirl in my head. Well, it's Margo H. Next slide, please. If you've seen me on Twitter, you know who I am, and you know I'm going to come to the defense of Black romance. Next slide, please. I need people to understand that a Black romance is a romance storyline about concerning, regarding, dealing with, focused on self-identified Black main characters. If a main character claims to be biracial, nope, not Black romance. If it's interracial, nope, not Black romance. I'm going to exercise expertise, my Blackness, and my opinion, also Blackness, to insist that Black main characters in romance own their Blackness, period. Next slide, please. Accomplices. Every year, Black romance authors and Black romance readers have to argue, ask, beg, plead, incite, urge, encourage folks to recognize and stand for Black romance. So I'm giving you a definition of the difference between accomplices and allies. I do this in my own academic field. I'm going to do it here. Accomplices, riding shotgun, holding that shotgun, loading that shotgun, while sitting next to a Black romance author and calling everyone out, regardless of color, ethnicity, racial identity, when they attempt to rewrite that definition. Allies, if you're not an accomplice, i.e. you remain silent about the definition of Black romance, you need to ask yourself if you're aiding and abetting racial capitalism and white supremacy. Okay, what I hope to share with you is a way of reading what, in my opinion, is paradoxically easy and difficult a romance novel for literary folks to engage with and do justice by. I've read essays on Indigo, the few that exist, and most of these essays deal with the African-American history that stands behind the book. Very few actually engage the genre that the book falls in. It's not historical fiction, it's a romance. So I want us to think about, for the next, let's just say hour, about the ways in which we can teach Indigo and any Black romance novel as a romance novel. The easy part, everything that we understand about the romance genre and its conventions are so evident in the storyline of the book, the characterizations, the obstacles overcome, and the romance closure, also known as the HEA. The romance genre in the age of modern racial capitalism is focused on white centricity, white supremacy, with its tentacles in the publishing industry. Critically talking about the romance genre involves hills, fences, houses, racism, colorism, race-making, classism, sexism, homophobism, transphobism, and feel free to add to this list. But they all come into play when we're talking about romance in general, and they come into play, whether consciously or unconsciously, when we think about Black romance. I think it's important to see the romance genre as an ethical and moral narrative, as a game-changing narrative. I think it's important to see Black romance as ethical and moral and game-changing. So when I thought about this, we're going to call it a class, but throw it in quotations, because this is a Margo romp. I thought about it in two ways: one, pedagogy, and two, scholarly writing. In part because I had 3 writing projects, all academic, that focused on one of 2 Beverly Jenkins novels, Indigo and Forbidden. Forbidden I discussed in Race and Romance. Indigo, I think is in it's in the volume, the special issue that Julie and I are doing. I think it's in there. I don't know. I have no idea where my essays are going, but they're there. And in thinking about how pedagogy and scholarly writing often diverge and yet should be intertwined, I thought this class might be useful for people who want to think about teaching these books and those who want to write about them. They are different media. And so I'm going to ask you not to confuse them. They're not mutually exclusive, but they're not the same. So for pedagogy, what you teach and why should be the first question. Why do you want to teach a Black romance? Why do you want to teach Indigo? And what you want to teach about it. Second, how you teach and to whom. There's a difference between teaching to non-white students and teaching to white students. and then teaching to a diverse classroom. So pedagogically, those are issues you need to engage beforehand. Goals. What are your goals? Okay, goals come from romance. If you're a romance writer, you know this one. But I also think we need to think about that because you're going to have different goals depending on who you're teaching. As a Black faculty member who would teach a romance class, I might someday, my goals are going to be different if that class is predominantly Black or predominantly non-white. Then it's going to be teaching a predominantly white classroom. If I were to teach this class at Santa Cruz, I'd be teaching a predominantly white class. Critical reading and thinking about the what. That is critical reading and thinking about the novel. The first thing I'd ask people about teaching Indigo is, are you going to teach it as a history text? Or are you going to teach it as a romance novel? Important distinctions to be made. The scholarly, which is usually written, and you actually have, in some capacity, a way of defining the presumptions and expectations of your readership. You can be affirmational or critical or both. You can destabilize the text relationship to presumptions about authorial intention and about the ideology of universal canonicity. No, right off the bat, I don't support any notions of universal canonicity. There is not a literary canon for me. There never is. There are authorial canons, but not a literature canon. Disciplinary impetus. Not all scholars of Black romance are literature folk. Not all are traditional feminist. Not all are rooted in academic romance scholarship. So if you're going to engage Black romance from a scholarly perspective, you need to remember that. Okay. You're going to have historians who are going to teach a book like Indigo or Forbidden or Back in the Day. I'm going to throw a Katrina Jackson book in here because Lord have mercy. I want to see where she is in 10 years because she has an exquisite romance voice. So how are you going to teach these texts, I think, or how are you going to write about these texts? It's important to recognize that there are disciplinary impetus. I would also say we need to begin to shatter those distinctions when we're doing romance, because romance is not just centered in literature, as we will discover. So I think it's important to recognize disciplines. I also think it's important to push against them. And that's something I always do. The ideology of literary canon has produced a defensive posture in romance in relation to the romance genre and among both readers and authors and writers of romance. Somehow there's a perception that there's literature and then there's romance. That perception I really take on in the introduction to Race and Romance. The idea that romance originates with Jane Austen and that era is wrong. Romance began, and somewhere circa 4th or 5th century BC, I think, maybe AD, but somewhere around there. Don't ask me about dates. It began with Greek authors. And one of the earliest ones, which I write about, is Heliodorus' An Ethiopian Romance, which is an interracial, if you like, romance. I'm not recommending that you read it because it is wild. It is off the charts, over the top, a romance. But it is where we get the conventions. It's where we get the idea of certain kinds of tropes that get tied to the romance genre. So I honestly want to encourage everyone in this room to not buy into the defensive posture. If someone says romance and literary, just say, no, I'm not buying it and walk on. Don't try to defend romance as if it were literature. Defend it as it is literature. Especially again, when we're coming to non-white romance fiction. The effect of maintaining that separation is regulate, diminish, and erase. I want to suggest that fiction genres don't lie about what they are and where they come from. In other words, if mama knows, that's all that matters. Next slide, please. Romance fiction, tropes versus tropes. One of the things that, okay, I'm a literary person, so I have to put this up there. In talking about romance, people like to talk about tropes as if they are completely understood and boxed. Tropes aren't. The trope has come to signify a specific practice in storytelling: enemies to lovers, secret baby, marriage of convenience, fake dating, close proximity, you name it, it's there. But trope means something more. And I think if we bring that back into relationship to romance fiction, then I think we begin to negate the treatment of romance as if it's not literary, because everything that a romance author engages in and does is literary. So I think it's important for us to remember that with the trope, it has a longer history and a kind of greater umbrella-ish significance, and one that we need to reinsert into our discussions and thinking about romance, and that it is a word or expression used in a figurative sense. I have up there mulatto gold. I have not found that word anywhere except in Indigo. And if someone finds it in another Jenkins historical romance, please let me know, because I've read all of them and it just stands out there. I looked it up. I can't find a definition. I asked Miss Jenkins what it meant, and she says what it is. It's like, it's Galen's complexion. But think about what that word is doing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it in terms of how you can move that trope of mulatto gold and everything that Ms. Jenkins does with gold and golden in terms of the representation of Galen Vachon into thinking about racial capitalism. Next slide, please. The romance is not bound by form. It's an excellent shapeshifter, and thus it structurally confounds as much as it organizes. It is often viewed as an adventure or quest, located more often than not in the past in nature. Now we see urban settings, but we also still will find romance situated in nature, and nature is always in quotes, in my opinion, and predicated upon the notion of a wandering heroic figure or heroic figures. And wandering can be not only in terms of literal wandering, but also emotional and mental wandering. Concepts such as salvation, redemption, realism, possibility, punishment are thematic hallmarks of the romance plot, while love and happily ever after are its generic conventions. What we need to remember about the romance genre is that it is always a social act, whether from the position of the reader or the position of the author. It's also a social act within the narrative itself. The second, I believe I have another quote, maybe. Can we do the next slide, please? If not, I'll read it to you. Yes, okay, you can leave it there. The romance's depiction of virtues such as chastity, honor, true love, and heroical figures were consistently valorized as moral and ethical exemplar in pre-modern cultural narratives. I want to suggest that that continues, and we see this coming to play in Indigo. I find that as a Black romance reader and as someone who's read countless Black romance novels, and as someone who's read countless historical romance novels, that we often forget that some of the thematic ideas in romance have a long history, and they especially come to bear in terms of our thinking about historical romance. And Indigo is a historical romance in so many ways. So the narrative of virtues come into play here, but the way in which they're calibrated is often different. So what fascinates me about Indigo, why I read this multiple times a year, even when it has nothing to do with an academic trajectory. There are competing narrative voices. One is structural, historical, instructive, and linear, and the other is pure romance storytelling with a dash of episodic, playfulness, discovery, and a resistance to the compelling grip of history. And that's why I said, I think you have to think about how, if you're going to teach it or write about this text, how you're going to frame it. If you're going to frame it as historical, then you need to understand that Ms. Jenkins both engages the history, but also offers a resistance to that through her use of the romance structure and the romance convention. Another thing that fascinates me about the novel is that it evokes what sits at the heart of the romance genre from its very inception, which I want to come back to: the episodic, the playfulness, the discovery, love, virtues, etc. And interestingly enough, given all of the craft narratives about what romance should do, especially when we're thinking about writing romance, contemporary romance, even historical, that you need to not engage in head hopping or POV shifts, except under certain structural conventions. Ms. Jenkins does not play with that. Okay. And I find that the POV shifts don't bother me mid-scene, mid-conversation, that in fact, they enable the romance narrative to work. In other ways that the romance conventions play out in this novel with respect to genre is the idea of risk-taking, both from authorial standpoint, but also from the actual internal narrative. That unconditional love always sits at the center of the romance, and unresolved obstacles at the novel's end also come into play, even as obstacles are resolved. And most importantly for me, the fictionalization of history. Next slide, please. So for me, I want to think about how I would engage if I'm going to teach. I'm doing this as if I'm going to teach, and I'm feeling very contained by my words here. So if I go off script, forgive me. But I want to begin with the scholarly side. And I'm going to intersperse my waxing poetic about what happens with words and what happens with these characters. I'm assuming that everyone has read Indigo. If you haven't, then hopefully what I will lead you with is a way to engage the novel's story with a different set of eyes. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. Colorism. One of the things that Indigo does is to destabilize, in my opinion, white supremacist and patriarchal ideologies that often surface in historical romance novels. Oh, geez. I hope you can see me. Um, I'm sorry, I kind of lost it there for a minute because I got a notice of an update. The destabilization of white supremacist and patriarchal ideologies. So one of the ways in which Indigo does it is to take head on the issue of colorism, take head on the idea of standard notions of feminine beauty, to take on women's sexuality, specifically the regulation and control of Black women's sexuality, to take head on issues of class that permeate African-American lives, both during periods of enslavement and after. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk first about colorism, but I'm going to bring all of these other issues into play as I move to this. In Race, the floating signifier, what more is there to say about race? Stuart Hall reminds us, citing W.E.B. Du Bois, that color, though of little meaning in itself, is really important as a badge for the social heritage of slavery, the dissemination and the insult of that experience. A badge, a token, a sign. Here indeed is the idea that race is a signifier and that racialized behavior and difference needs to be understood as discursive, not necessarily as a genetic or biological fact. Next slide, please. One of the moments that just kind of stood out for me was when Janine Quint, the wife of Foster Quint, who was supposed to be the fiance of Hester Wyatt, asks Galen, do you consider yourself a member of the race? And Galen's response is, yes, Miss Quint, I consider myself a member of the race. She shrugged because, and he says, why would I not? She shrugs, because some mulattoes choose not to. They use their skin and their well-connected families to escape the hardships we darker souls must endure. In that little exchange, so much of what takes place in this book is encapsulated. One of the things that Jenkins does so well is to foreground the way in which an internalized notion of racial identity linked colorism gets played out in the context of an African-American community, and the way in which it gets played out in terms of thinking about romance. We have to assume that Janine Quint is of a lighter color than Hester Wyatt. We have to assume that Janine Quint sees herself as superior to Hester Wyatt and inferior to Galen Vachon. So one of the things that for me is important to hold on to when you're reading this text, when you're thinking about it, is the way in which colorism linked to racial identity, linked to the way in which one identifies as a member of the race or not, okay, is constantly rendered unstable in this book. How does Ms. Jenkins do this? Through white passing. She does, in 2 books, she fully engages and tackles the question of the relationship between colorism, white passing, Blackness with a capital B, and race. Forbidden and Indigo, but she treats it differently. And I'm not going to talk about Forbidden in this moment. In Forbidden, Ryan Fontaine deliberately engages in white passing. It is secret. He doesn't reveal himself till maybe about 2/3 or so in the novel as being a Black man. He avoids his Blackness, but recognizes it by doing things for the Black community. So he tries to walk this fine line that many historical individuals walked in order to work towards the improvement, the betterment of African-American peoples after enslavement, at the same time recognizing that their proximity to whiteness affords them a place in a power structure denied to them if they admitted to their Blackness. I hope that makes sense. Galen doesn't do that. Galen owns his Blackness within the community as Galen Vachon, accepts that his status as a free Black from Louisiana, his wealth, his class affords him the ability to say, I'm Black. However, if my appearance allows me to destabilize the ideology of colorism, to destabilize your notions of race, to destabilize a race code, then I'm going to do it. And he tells this to Hester in the moments, it's in the book that I'm on. He tells this to Hester when she asks about his abolitionist efforts. He says, I've pretended to be Portuguese. I've been an Italian, a Haitian Italian. I've been a count. I've been all these things. White people see what they want to see is basically what he's saying. If they see me as white, they treat me as white. If I disrupt what they see, that perception of objectivity, that what we see is real, then I'm able to do the things that I do. Ironically, of course, his passing is what lands him in Whitaker, Michigan, and in Hester's home, and in the relationship of his life. So the idea that somehow colorism, especially when it's framed as Black and white, is stable, immutable, is completely turned upside down with this text. One of the things that both Du Bois and Hall grasp as an important way of thinking about race in America, and I have to remind you, I am talking about race in the United States and the ways in which it has instantiated this country from its inception on the backs of enslaved Africans transported to a land that white Europeans do not own, never will own, that they snatched, that they settled and colonized, that the whole issue of race that I'm talking about, predicated on colorism, is a false narrative. But dismantling the racecraft of that narrative is not an easy task. The issue of Anglo-American racial capitalism sustains itself on a false dichotomy of colorism, which feeds anti-Blackness, so pervasive in contemporary Anglo-American cultures. And I'm going to argue in the way in which people are constantly trying to rewrite what Black romance is. It's not easily taken apart. It's not easily disseminated. Dismantled. It's not easily eradicated. But I think once we begin to understand colorism, next slide, please, as a commodity and as white passing and white presenting as commodities within colorism, then we can begin to understand Galen's perspective about the utility of his proximity to whiteness as a means of overturning the enslavement of his people. Next slide, please. The last point before I move to a discussion of beauty and colorism, I want to suggest that we always remind ourselves with respect to Black romance, but also with respect to romance in general. And that is, if you understand that colorism is a commodity and that it can be performed by those who are in close proximity to one color or the other, that any form of passing and presenting must be seen as simultaneously valuable and unprofitable in romance fiction. By that, I mean it's valuable because it sells and unprofitable because it can be deconstructed, dismantled, and criticized. Colorism and beauty has a long-standing place in romance. One of the things that I write about in terms of race and romance in the book is how certain idealized images of beauty circulate, get mapped onto romance, get unmapped and then remapped in different ways. And specifically, we're talking about an idealized Europeanized version of beauty, what we would call proximity to white skin, proximity to blue eyes, proximity to blonde hair. So the closer you are to that, the more beautiful you become. The further away from that you are, the more, I'm going to use unbeautiful you are. So what Jenkins does, and as she said in the podcast, one of the things that she wept about was when, and I had this experience when I read this book, the fact that there was a woman whose Blackness was so incredibly beautiful that it brought a man to his knees, okay? In effect, what Indigo does exquisitely is to deconstruct standard romance notions of beauty. Galen says to Hester when he sees her hands, "You have beautiful hands, Hester Wyatt. They're like exotic indigo orchids." Now, if you're familiar with orchids, you know orchids come in a range of colors. But if you've ever seen an indigo orchid, it is stunning. The visual that image evoked in me stays with me and should stay with you every time Galen uses the word indigo. There is such emotion, such passion, such respect, and such awe in that phrase. They're like exotic indigo orchids. So the first thing that we do when Galen evokes that image is to know we're not talking about white hands. Therefore, we're not talking about a white body. When Foster says, in response to a comment about women, he says, women can be remarkable, can be quite remarkable, can't they? Take Hester, for example. Okay, now you should all be sitting on your seats if you read the book or like right now, like, there's a reason Galen calls him Frederick. There's a reason Galen misspeaks his name all the time. Foster says, take Hester, for example. She's no beauty, but her mind is first rate. How many Black women whose color is at a distant proximity to whiteness have been complimented by their mind, about their mind, but not their beauty? How many of us have been praised for our intelligence, for our wit, but not our beauty? And in the very next breath, Foster says to his wife, "You, my darling," after she demands, "Well, what about me?" "You, my darling, are as beautiful as she." So again, that standard of beauty, because we have to assume based on this, that Janine has a closer proximity to white European standards of beauty than Hester. The invocation of Shiva, I think, is an important, subtle deconstruction of what Foster has to say, because there's a long association of Shiva with non-white beauty. Even in the early modern period, it was understood that Shiva was of African descent, African origins, and therefore part of a fair, dark dichotomy, and Shiva would be read as leaning towards the darker side of beauty. Still beautiful, because Solomon praises her beauty, but the darker side. Galen's reaction, which he doesn't voice, so it's between Galen and the reader. She, Hester, was as beautiful as a black velvet sky, beautiful as a sunrise. The contrast between, again, morning, light, and dark, night. Okay. Jenkins plays with that image, but in Galen's mind, the standard of both beauties is Hester. So one of the things that I, and I would encourage literary scholars and others to look at, is the way in which Jenkins uses language, the language of fertility, the language of agrarianism, of farming, the language of metal as part of her language of love. Typical pre-modern romance. Women as commodities, but also unique commodities. Beauty as a commodity, but also a unique commodity. Commodities that can be destabilized, but also reinforced. Commodities that can be reimagined, but also reinforced in terms of constructing a narrative of beauty. So much of what goes on in this text, in my opinion, is a deconstruction of a normalized beauty and reconstruction of a normalized beauty, but one not dependent on the dichotomy of fair and dark as absolutes, but as, from the standpoint of colorism, as a range, so that a fair beauty does not negate a dark beauty. So I want to come back just for a moment to mulatto gold. The word golden is used to describe Galen Vachon's complexion. The word mulatto gold, and like I said, I've really searched for it. It appears pretty much just once, very early on the text, page 6, when the text says the injuries had drained the color from his mulatto gold complexion. I don't know about y'all, but that phrase, mulatto gold, arrested me. First, because it speaks to Galen's class. Mulattoes were in a different racial classification than non-mulattoes. And if you're not familiar with what early modern Spain's kind of I'm going to call them racializing courts did, was they created a classification system that was taken into the New World, into the colonies, and then appropriated by the English to use within the context of their own racial ideologies and descriptive narratives to distinguish among Black peoples in the United States. So if you think about the term octoroon, quadroon, mulatto, they used Negro or Black. Those classification systems didn't mark just colorism, it also marked class. Because you were more likely to find among free Blacks, mulattoes, octoroons, and quadroons. Quadroons were basically as close as you can get to white without being white. So the fact that there's a link between his mulatto status and gold suggests that color is a commodity. And it becomes used throughout this text as a way of marking the internalization of racism and race making. And it's important to understand that if you're going to engage in the deconstruction of it. It also allowed me to think about how I, as a reader, the first 3 or 4 times that I read this book, failed to link this romance novel to racial capitalism and what racial capitalism has done, not only with Black bodies taken from the African continent, but what was done to Black bodies in the colonized settlements, and how Black bodies continue to perform as racial capital in the contemporary world, and specifically in romance publishing. That's a book that some year, some century I may play with, or an essay I may play with. But I'm asking you to think about the way in which the language in this specific text drives at the heart of racial capitalism. And mulatto gold is that colorizing function that racial capitalism engages in and sends out into the world. Honestly, there is no Black and white in terms of race. There's Black and white in terms of colorism. And what racecraft does is to use colorism and then Black and white and shades of Blackness, I'm gonna throw brown in there, to sustain an ideology of superiority that we buy into. So mulatto gold makes me think about the function of white supremacy in this text differently. Indigo makes me think of how a pair of hands completely destabilize the function of white supremacy within this text from the perspective of Blackness. When Galen starts to fall for Hester very early on, okay? I mean, like, from the moment he looks at her and he sees those hands, it's like, okay, he's done for, we know it. Yes, he's over the top, but yes, he is going to fall hard. We know he's a player. We know he's, he is a womanizer in his own way. He's a gentleman. He is the perfect historical hero. He is the perfect romance hero from the inception of romance all the way to now. And we know he's going to fall hard. He says, when she corrects him about her using Indigo rather than Hester, he tells her, you're not a Hester, you are an Indigo. Hesters are joyless, pruny old women who look down their noses at sinners like me. Take the word of an authority on women. Indigo is what you are. Indigo is who you will be. At least to me, you will be Indigo. And from that moment on, we walk his path as he courts, as he woos Indigo. What can he do to win this woman's love? Not realizing that he already has it because she's fallen for him, but it's like he has to work against who he has been most of his adult male life to figure out how to claim the heart of the woman that he wants. He asks himself, what hasn't she seen? Has she seen the fabled walls of China, the great pyramids of Egypt? Has she ever walked through the vibrant marketplaces of Havana or had her fortune told in Madrid? He realized he wanted to make up for all she lacked in the past. Drape her in silks, gift her with pearls to match her eyes. Okay. This is about the deconstruction of a notion of beauty that is predicated on colorism that privileges whiteness. So everything that Galen is about in this text is deconstructing the privileges of whiteness. Next slide, please. So I'm doing a quick, okay, so you need to know that I'm like picking and choosing stuff to get you to think about, because there's so much that one can do with every page of this text. And you could spend an hour literally deconstructing, interpreting, engaging, rewriting, rethinking, reordering Indigo. So I have kind of identified moments for me in the narrative that speak to the romance genre and the way in which this text serves the romance genre. So this one's called Moments That Change Everything, and they occur like literally throughout the book. But the ones for me that are very romance oriented, first and foremost, the play at the river. All right. When Galen says, "Have you ever made mud pies?" And there's this heated exchange about her removing her shoes. It's one thing for him to see her hands. Okay. It's another for him to see her feet. And she is so resistant. And he is over the top. Okay. I'm going to tell you right now, he really is over the top in the push to get her to remove the brogans, to get rid of those shoes, to come and play. And part of this is him getting her to understand that she is an Indigo, not a Hester. And then that whole moment, you see a shift in both characters, where it's not just in terms of sexual sensual attraction, but in terms of the romance. The discovery that takes place between these two would-be lovers about each other, about who they are, the conversations, the revealing of themselves at incremental moments throughout this text begin, I would argue, with this moment of play. The sensual, sexual part of the romance emerges when she walks in on Galen's bath and he gets out and she's checking him out, all right? And there's that moment when that virtuous woman, the Hester, the prim, proper, prunish, young old woman is shed like, okay, like a new skin has to emerge, that she becomes Indigo. She rids herself of that in that moment, but in her mind, because her world is changing because of Galen Bishop. And then there's the heartbreak of separation that moves the romance forward. The obstacle, he has to go back on the road. He has to heal, he has to return to being the Black Daniel. That is front and center for his recuperation, his physical recuperation. It is not front and center for his heart. And this is the moment when I'm sitting there and I get weepy. I don't know about y'all, but some things will make me cry. Galen also wanted to ask her not to marry Foster before his return, but knew he had no right, at least not yet. Instead, he asked, "Promise me you won't make mud pies with anyone else while I'm gone." Hester couldn't suppress her watery smile. "I promise." Okay, such a simple declaration of love. "Promise me you won't make mud pies with anyone else while I'm gone. I promise." completely shifts the narrative, in a way that a romance narrative with zillions of obstacles is suddenly solved. We still are going to see those obstacles. But in this moment, we know, they're immaterial, simply around an image of mud pies. In asking her to not make mud pies with anyone else, it is both asking her not to engage in any kind of sensual, sexual relationship. That's front and center. Because he has actually broken that bar. He wants to be typical hero, the one who brings her into her own sexuality. But it's also about the romance. He doesn't want her to become emotionally committed, doesn't want her to give her heart to anyone else. And we see this in this line. And by invoking that play at the river and getting her to make a promise, it's a commitment of love. Next slide, please. And then there's the moment for me. There's always one moment. It comes towards the end of the book in a Beverly Jenkins historical romance where one of the main characters discovers that life without the other is untenable. One of the things that okay, don't quote me on this. One of the things that I've discovered in reading her historical romances is that this particular representation, this moment when a character realizes that life is untenable without the other, is most often occurs with her male characters. We see it with Galen, we see it with Ryan, we see it with Ian and Preacher, we see it with her male characters most often. The women can go about their lives. Okay, I love you, but you know what? Honey, I can exist without you. I'm doing fine, all right? It's the men who experienced this moment, all right, of finding that their lives cannot exist without this woman in it. And for Galen, it occurs as he's holding his sleeping wife against his heart. She was the most precious addition to his life. Without her, he would have continued on his solitary path, never feeling the fresh air of her love blowing across his world-weary soul. I mean, just like sit with that image for a minute. You want someone to feel that soul deep about you, okay? You want someone to have that thought about you. It is the moment that Galen understands himself. Throughout the novel, he puts Hester first. He does stuff her. I mean, the negligees. He wants her out of those raggedy clothes. He wants her out of those raggedy shoes. He wants her not to starve herself to feed others. He wants her not to sell her land in order to survive. He wants her to be able to experience life without want, economic want, without financial want, without sensual want, without sexual want, without, I was trying to figure out how I was going to say without love want, but that just sounded weird, without having experienced love. That is Galen's like purpose. He's driven to do this. And it's interesting that he discovers his love for her very early on. He doesn't understand it because he has resisted putting himself in love's way. And so when he falls absolutely, completely, and unabashedly. And so Over the top is absolutely the perfect way to describe Galen Vachon. He's over the top in everything that he does for her, including loving her. Sorry, I gotta take a moment on that. So the ending of the book, it is typical romance. You have your romance hero and your romance heroine put into a situation that threatens not just their relationship, but one of their lives or both their lives. We had, and often it's both their lives, especially in early modern romances, it was both of their lives. In Heliodorus's An Ethiopian Romance. And I'll briefly, very briefly, because that's another text that I can wax poetic on. Margo's romp through the text. Chariclea is the white presenting daughter of Ethiopian king and queen. Theogenes is a Greek man that she falls in love with as an adult when she's adopted by a Greek because her mom fears for her life and that she will be rejected by her Black father because she's white presenting. And so she has Chariclea exposed, and a Greek finds her and rescues her, and he's wealthy and he brings her up and all this good stuff. So Chariclea and Theogenes go on amazing adventures. They're captured by pirates. Excuse me. They are freed, they fight. Theogenes is seduced by Arcetes, and to save his life, Chariclea tells him to go ahead and sleep with Arcetes because it won't affect the love that she and he have. He doesn't, he remains a virgin. They end up in Ethiopia. Father doesn't believe that she's his daughter until the mom says, yes, this is what happened. The mom's eunuch who has stayed around Chariclea says, yes, this has happened. And here's the proof. Chariclea's adopted father says, here's what came with her. And finally, the eunuch says, and she has a mark that you have, a birthmark. And it's revealed, and daddy says, oh yes, and she walks in as an Ethiopian princess, and they live happily ever after. Okay, so along the way, though, she's constantly saving Theogenes. Okay, it's not really a swear word. She's constantly saving Theogenes' ass as they go through there. And he finally gets enough gumption to save her on occasion. But by and large, she's an amazing figure of a romance heroine's strength, independence, and moving forward. So in typical early modern romance narratives, the heroine becomes a kind of weaker force, and it's a hero who is to the rescue. Jenkins inverts that from the very beginning because it is Galen who is weakened, whose life is threatened, who has to be rescued, who has to be saved. And it is the heroine, Hester, who does all that. Well, of course, we're going to have to give Galen his moment, and it comes with the nasty, disgusting shoe. And I'm telling you, when those writers come in, all in Black, and Jenkins turns the narrative upside down, you expect Galen to, basically kill Shu, or say, kill him, whatever you want to do with him, just, I want him dead, and then take Hester and return home. That's normally what happens in early modern romances. That's normally what happens in terms of getting rid of the villain, getting rid of the threat, getting rid of the obstacles, so that they don't recur. Jenkins doesn't do that because she knows that the history she's drawing upon, okay? Antebellum US pre-Civil War US, the fight for abolitionism, the fight to end slavery, the fight to end the enslavement of Black people, the fight to make sure that they are free isn't going to end simply because Galen and Hester have a happily ever after. So what she does is she gives them that happily ever after. He takes his wife home. She's pregnant. They have their child. She's reunited with her mother, and so on. But the fight continues, even amidst that happily ever after. The resolution with the villain is the most satisfying one I've come across in my readings of romance. Selling Shu into slavery in North Africa is brilliant. I know there's some people say, well, it's slavery, you shouldn't sanction it. Yes, until white people this is me at the end of that book. Until white people fully understand what it means as a species to be enslaved, they're never going to get outside of white supremacy. You can read all of the books, you can have all the compassion, everything that you want, but until you fully understand that experience, you're not going to get outside of it. You can empathize, but you can't share. So one of the things that intrigues me about this book is the fact that from the standpoint of readership, this book is for a Black readership. It speaks to a history that Black readership would understand in terms of our place in the United States, in terms of what it means to resist, what it means to struggle, what it means to love, what it means to find joy, what constitutes beauty, what constitutes masculinity, over the top, but also some of the tenderest moments. All right. When he's making love to her, it is an incredible, incredible moment of tenderness, of understanding, of respect, of love, of admiration, of awe between Galen and Hester. That's captured in the language of the book. That's when he's holding a sleeping wife against his heart. And Galen realizes she is the most precious addition to his life. Without her, he has no life. Okay. Without her, his path is solitary. Without her, there's no fresh air. Okay. All of that's at work. And yet, because it's an historical novel, history doesn't disappear from this text. And Shu gets his comeuppance. Okay. The villains get their comeuppance. Foster gets relegated to wherever Foster, I was almost going to say Frederick, but to wherever Foster goes. The thing about this text is that every layer of Black American society, historically, and history continues, so historically, is layered. It is not linear. It is not a simplistic plane. It is calibrated. It's nuanced. It's complicated. You had people who turned against the enslaved, who themselves were Black. Jenny. You had people who were white who fought to end enslavement. You had people who fell in love with the enslaved and demanded that they return to them because of their love, had children with them, and yet had no problem selling away their children with the enslaved. All of that is tempered into this so that you walk away from this with a complex representation, not just of love, not just of romance, how to seduce the woman you love with lots of good stuff, including vanilla, but about the romance genre. And if you're going to teach the romance genre and you're going to teach Black romance, I think you have to respect the complexity. When Black writers say, this is not for you, white writers, this is for Black readers. This is not for you, white readers, this is for Black readers. This is not for you, white scholars, this is for Black scholars. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm saying you have to respect that. And I think Jenkins Indigo insists upon that. She's not saying don't read it. All of y'all should read it. I don't care who you are. I think this book should be taught in every literature class. Every literature class as a moment of here's how it's done, folks. That's just my opinion. But I think you have to understand what it means to engage Black romance if you're not a Black reader, a Black scholar, a Black author, and rest on that position. And no, you're not the center of this gaze. This gaze is not for you. And I think it's an important point to make at this time. Conclusions. Okay, next slide, please. I think, yeah, okay. A lot of what I've just truncated in this, I discuss in Race and Romance. It does start from, Heliodorus, really starts from the mid 16th century, but the function of Heliodorus is an Ethiopian romance in terms of thinking about race and colorism and passing and presenting. And there is a chapter on forbidden in this text. And what it means to think about white passing, white presenting in terms of how silly it is to privilege a dichotomy based on color. In Race and Romance, I argue since the mid 16th century in Anglo-American culture, the romance genre, the idea of romance and colorism have long been intertwined in subtle and not so subtle ways. I also make a claim for seeing colorism as a commodity, and in particular, the performative subject positions of white passing and white presenting depicted in the text I discuss as simultaneously valuable and unprofitable in romance fiction. What inspired me was Beverly Jenkins' Indigo. Those purple hands intrigued me and inspired me. So thank you, Beverly Jenkins, for writing this book. Thank you for showing up. And now we can have some fun with questions because I feel like I'm beyond the structured part and I've been very, very good. Not one F-bomb. All right. So if you have questions, if you'll type them into the chat, Julie will feed them to me and I'll respond. If you have comments you want to make, we're kind of going to just kind of slide over them a little bit because we really want people's questions to be answered. And you can ask me anything. Yeah, you can ask me anything. Okay, and I'll answer. Might not like the answer, but I'll answer. Hey, all of y'all. I recognize a lot of y'all from Twitter. Hi, Tasha. Hi, Kenya. Right. Y'all have no, oh, come on. Okay, this is like a class. All right.
I'm sorry, they're coming in, Margo. They're coming in. All right. So the first one, I came in late. Can you say where we can get your book? And another question, did you start as an academic with an interest in writing romance or the reverse? Okay. All right. So Race and Romance, thank you. Because sometimes I'm ancient and I forget things. Race and Romance, Coloring the Past is coming out June this year. Okay.
sometimes being Margo Hendricks is a good thing. It is open access. What that means is that if you have, it should be available. I'll find out, I'll post it on Twitter, but that means you shouldn't have to pay for it if you can't afford it. That was part of the negotiations and contracting with the press. I was not going to give an academic press as much revenue without me getting royalties, and academic presses don't like to slap royalties if they can avoid it, unless you're Henry Louis Gates or Stephen Greenblatt or any of those people. So open access means that you'll be able to access it, probably they'll do it through academic channels, and like I said, I'll figure that out and make sure you know about it on Twitter and other social media. But it means you'll be able to download the ebook and read it at your leisure. So it will be coming out, and I'll keep you posted because I'll promote it. I actually wrote my very first romance as an adult when I was working in the post office. Yeah, I got a past, y'all. We're not going to talk about my past because it's not time to do it. But yeah, I got a past. Those people, some people in Wordmaker know about my past. It sucked. It sucked that I haven't. I mean, it was the worst romance ever. There was absolutely no sex. The protagonists were they were a mess. Okay, they were a real mess. But I knew I wanted to write romance. I ended up in the academy as a fluke because I was going to law school. I was going to become a corporate lawyer, make a lot of money, retire, and write fiction. That was my goal when I started. I also didn't go to college until I was 27. I got my PhD officially awarded when I was 40. Okay. You can Google me and find out how old I am, but if you want to know, I'm 74. So yeah, close your mouth. I saw that. And my trajectory was, and I fell into early modern studies because of one, I fell in love with Christopher Marlowe, and a white professor said, you know, I've only met 2 African-American scholars who do Shakespeare, and they've kind of left and moved to African-American literature and diasporic literature. I've not met a Black woman who does Renaissance and early modern English literature and Shakespeare studies and stuff. And I want to be a lawyer. She said, well, you can go to law school after. It'll only take you a couple of years to get your JD. Okay, I sent her a letter and said, you lied, you lied, you lied. Okay, no one told me what a PhD involved. I got a PhD. I ended up at Santa Cruz. My first Shakespeare meeting, I was about ready to switch fields because I walked into a room with over 300 or more people, and I didn't see any Black people until I always sit in the front. So I made my way to the front, and there was a Black woman who was seated with a group of faculty to my right. I sat to my left. I'm left-handed, so I always sit to my left. And then there was a South Asian, dark-skinned woman who was seated, I think, in the row behind the Black woman here. And this was in Philadelphia, and it was my very first Shakespeare conference. And this woman, who's a romance author, made some comments, and I raised my hand and asked about race, and I was dismissed. And I said, excuse me, come on, excuse me, I asked a question and you dismissed it, but it's a fair question. Would you mind answering it? She had no idea who I was. Okay, I'm just a lowly little whatever. So she was dismissive and then about to go on. And an Englishman seated next to the Black woman, the other Black woman in the room, said, her question deserves an answer, and your answer was not satisfactory. And she shouldn't have to insist that you answer the question. And because he was very well known, the woman did it. It was at that point that I decided I was going to be Margo Hendricks in the academy, meaning I don't take any crap. Okay, I'm not going to buy you guys lunch, and I know you're just waiting. I have a wager going. And from that point on, I was I discovered 6 Black Shakespeareans at research institutions in this country who actually didn't walk away from Shakespeare studies. That's how I ended up. I still wrote romances on the side. I convinced myself an academic job would allow me to do that. I'd be able to sit and write my romances and publish them under a pen name, do my academic crap, and then retire and write romance full time. Lie, lie, lie. I lied to myself. I had no idea what academia was like. So just know that you don't use academia as a means to do the kind of work that you really want to do, okay? It's a job, and treat it as a job. And the work that you are committed to in your heart that you want to do, you do it regardless of academia, because academia will denigrate, especially romance. Academics denigrate romance, except in my presence, and I call them on it all the time, but they think they can get away with it. Not as long as I live. Okay, so question number 2.
I'm sorry, the first one is the one that talks about
the competing narratives. Okay.
That's it. Yep.
Yeah, got that. When I talk about competing narratives, I'm talking about the narrative of history that Jenkins is writing, constructing in the romance novel. And then, so that is one narrative voice. And if you actually read the passages, then you'll discover that they're linear, they're kind of factual, there's no play in them. There's no, the imaginary language at work in the romance is not divorced from those moments of telling us what was going on. It exists alongside, but it doesn't intrude in. So there's a way in which the historian's voice that Jenkins does so well in her historical romances, which is ever present in these narratives, is there when she's recounting what's going on at the time in the moment, whether it's Galen, Hester, the newspapers, or someone recounting about, look at the description of John Brown's attack at Harper's Ferries. Look at those moments. And then the second narrative voice is the romance author's voice. The love of the language, the play with the language, the construction of sensuality around sexuality, but also around the romance relationship that's developing, I talk with my hands, that's developing between Galen and Hester. The moments when we are just gobsmacked. Like in the coach scene is like, it inspired me to write a coach scene in a 17th century historical work in progress, because I wanted to recreate that moment when Galen dabs the vanilla all over her after his grandmother's death, and he says, I want you, whenever someone comes up to you, to remember these places on your body. All right. And then he goes after it in the coach scene. Oh my God, I will never think about vanilla again the same. And I love vanilla. I love the smell. We grew up with it. I mean, it evoked my great grandmother who used vanilla as a scent. It's so visceral, it is so sensual in terms of the senses, and it is such a great kink in that coach. Okay. That's the romance narrative voice. So that's what I mean about that. Are there any other books on the descriptions of beauty in romance you recommend? Nobody's really writing that because nobody deals with it. Everybody talks about fair and dark. Okay, I'm gonna take, actually that's a lie. My best friend, Kim Hall, wrote a book called Things of Darkness. It's about early modern literature, but she has a fabulous discussion on beauty from the Renaissance. All right, and it's the concept that still shades our ideologies about beauty and feminine beauty and what it is, about the fair dark, about size, about, and again, that changes, but about appearance, about the relationship between helplessness and beauty. So anyone who is self-sufficient, of course, is going to deviate from that standardized white beauty that's there. So Things of Darkness does that early on, but you have to, it's an academic book, but Kim is brilliant, and I think you'll learn a lot from it. But honestly, it is something to be done, and if someone knows about it, just drop it in the chat, that if there's an academic who is writing about that. But remember, it can't be about whiteness. We're not talking about white beauty. We're talking about colorism and beauty as a part of colorism, okay? I really am working hard to get us to decenter the white gaze as the medium. Okay, it's called, okay, the author's name is Heliodorus, Heliodorus. The book's title is Ethiopia or Ethiopica. I'd have to write it, but it's called An Ethiopian Romance. If you type in Heliodorus, you'll find him. And the interesting thing is he was not Greek born, and therefore the book does a lot with ethnicity and so on. And it also engages a representation of the Greeks as inferior to the Ethiopians in terms of their majesty, in terms of their rule and so on. It's really an interesting read that if people, someone actually did teach a romance class with these books from, it was a year-long class, but from, wait, that's what my book does. Anyway, from the Greeks to now, you'd see the transformation of the romance novel into a tool of white supremacy by the 16th century. And that is pretty much the argument of race and romance, is that's what happened. It becomes there. Do I have articles we can read in the meantime? No, because I was lazy. I took 10 years off of academia. I didn't write any academic articles until 2020. Okay, about romance, they're forthcoming. I'm really sorry. They're forthcoming. I apologize. When did I first hear of Beverly Jenkins? It was at the end of the 90s when I read early 2000 when I read, did I read Vivid first or Midnight? It may have been Vivid that hooked me into her canon, and then I went back and started reading. And I'm a historical romance fan. I really am. I love contemporary. I write contemporary. I do all that. But you're always going to find I default to his historical romance as what really kind of shifted me in that. Okay, so like the first time I met her, can I tell you? Can I gush for 1 second? First time I met her, it was at RWA before it imploded in San Diego, and I went up to her, and I just went. I was doing this, and I said, "Okay, I'm a fangirl," And she was, that's all right, sis. And I said, I love Indigo. I love Indigo. And then I said, thank you. And I walked away. Okay. Now, some of the other people who actually introduced me to her know me as Margo Hendricks, and I'm an academic, and they kind of people Google me, which is weird when somebody come back and tell you they Google you. I don't think about myself in terms of an academic presence, but I was like ready to just like worship at her feet for writing these books, okay? Because, and I later on when I got a chance to just chit chat with her in DMs, is I said, you have no idea someone who grew up in a family rife with colorism, because the presumption was proximity to whiteness means greater success. How important Indigo was to me. All of her books are important to me because she really does give us black heroines. But Indigo was the first, okay? Because she was the blackest of the blackety black, in my opinion. So I do the, what's my Twitter handle? It's Elizabeth Grace. ELYSABETH, Grace. I can do that one easily. So that, she is so gracious. She takes no crap. She's less out there than I am. I'm kind of out there on occasion. But just, it's there. But you want to know the book that did it to me, that made me think I could be a historical romance writer? Octavia Butler's Wild Seed. It's considered speculative fiction, yeah, but it's the most amazing historical love story about Blackness. Okay, amazing, amazing. And it's a paranormal, but the love story, and it's set in history, and it inspired the first two books of my Daughters of Syria series, okay, and John Milton, because I ain't got good sense.
Margo, I'm sorry. There's a question that came in that is about pedagogy, and there are 1,000,001 questions, and I am feeding them to Margo, so don't worry. But one of them is asking an interesting thing that I'm curious about too. Can you discuss a bit more about the primary sources in your approach, themes explored in teaching Black romance for a majority Black class versus a majority white class? I'm imagining what I could have had at Howard.
Good luck. Ooh, the edge of midnight, okay. The problem, okay, there's a fundamental problem if you're thinking from the standpoint of romance scholarship. Rita Dandridge's book, she has, I don't have the citation here, I'm really sorry, but Rita Dandridge's book on African-American romance is a go-to for me when I taught romance. I haven't taught in a decade, so I'm out of the loop on what's being done, but I have done my research. And the problem for me is when white scholars work on romance, they will look at Black romance authors like Miss Jenkins, and in my opinion, do the Black romance a disservice. Here's what I mean. People love Catherine Roach's book on romance. And she has a chapter on Beverly Jenkins. And I read it. I didn't cite it in my essay for the issue that Julie and I do, that'll be coming out in the summer for the Journal of Popular Romance Studies. I didn't cite Catherine Roach's discussion because she started from the perspective of Black trauma. People start Indigo looking at the letter, and you notice I haven't talked about it, that begins it, the prologue that begins it, because that colors the perspective. And Ms. Jenkins says she doesn't write trauma porn, Black trauma porn. You read, and the approach to this book often is through that. The approach to any of her books, I have a feeling, when talking about romance, will be from Blackness, and then romance is over here. Here's a love story. So they'll treat it as it's a love story, but not as if it's part of the genre. I just think romance scholarship really needs to get over itself with defending romance and write about it as a genre and not about what literary folks, academic literary folks and literary critics have to say about it. I think we just need to get past that. But pedagogically, when I am trying to compile something that will work now, which means I'm reading this, and it's not impossible, but there's very little work done on it. So you end up going to African-American literature, and romance is literature, but it's a different category. And it has its own conventions and its own way of engaging the literariness of the written word. So how do you make that work? I think you can locate it with the novels coming out of, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that deal with romance. But again, the way in which those novels grapple with history, you're going to have to talk about them in their own context and then talk about contemporary Black romance. By contemporary, I mean late 20th century now, romance in their context, because they're very different writing techniques, very different things that will be constituted as part of the romance narrative that didn't exist. So I think pedagogically, start from your own perspective in terms of what you think. If you're a Black feminist, start there. If you're a Black historian, start there. But don't do disservice to the romance genre. So kind of what I'm suggesting, you got to be familiar with the genre itself in order to make the case for Black romance generically. I hope that pedagogically answered the question. I just haven't really been able to find a lot of stuff. Julie actually did, like, if I were going to do this, I'd start with Julie. Julie Moody Freeman has written about Black romance. I'd start there. The essay, the collection of essays that we have coming out, there's a bibliography that hopefully will direct people. But it's hard with historical romances because guess what? Black folks don't read historical romances. Did you know that? That's why they're there. And so historical romance as a subgenre of romance is treated as a white category as opposed to doing it. So when people read Beverly Jenkins, they try to fit her into that white categorization. Oh, by the way, she's also talking about Blackness here. Rather than, this is a Black romance, this is what's going on. So I'm hoping to change some of that a little bit after I get to writing romance over the next year or so. But it's a work in progress, because honestly, when I was teaching, there was nothing called Black romance. It was Black literature, if it was called that. So, all right. Oh, geez. Oh, Lord have mercy. Question number 12. Wow. Yes? You know, okay, so I'm going to skip a little bit.
I'm sorry, Margo. Only you are seeing the questions, so they.
I'm sorry. There was a question. I'm sorry. There was a question about some of the same racial capitalism, a contemporary counterpoint to Indigo Jenkins' novel, The Edge of Midnight. And so how do you, or how might you place the two in conversation with each other? Oh, please, may I swear I'll buy you lunch when I come. been so good. I don't know how to fucking answer that question right now because I haven't thought about it. Okay, that was my only F-bomb. It is a brilliant question. It is absolutely a brilliant question. So what y'all saying is I need to write a book about all of her canon in order to answer all of the questions that I'm posing. I'm gonna say the issue with racial capitalism in relation to contemporary Black romance has to be calibrated differently than racial capitalism with respect to the historical romances, because there's no enslavement, in quotes, right now in the United States, in quotes, in terms of a whole body of people, specifically of Black people. So I think I'd have to frame this about a variation of racial capitalism that allows us to perpetuate a notion of freedom, even as we are constantly being inculcated into racial capitalism. Our participation is required. I'd have to think about that question. I'm really sorry if this sounds fudgy as heck, but I honestly hadn't thought about it because I've been thinking about it in terms of her historical and that. I apologize. Y'all just make me think. Do I see a relationship between Saadia Hartman's work and Jenkins' work? They're very different. One, because fiction versus and I'm gonna say a Black intellectual philosophical discourse. Yes, there is a connection to a relationship to be made. I think from the standpoint of using Hartman's work as a framework, just so you know, I read a lot of recent work on Black love in terms of academic writings. I'll take that work. Okay, my Twitter handle is Elizabeth Grace. I will create a Google Doc with some of the stuff that I read and informed my thinking in writing race and romance. And I'll share it with you. That I can promise you. Thank you for my contribution. Oh, you're welcome. I try. But yeah, I mean, honestly, if I were going to walk into a classroom today, I'm actually thinking about designing a course and trying it out at Santa Cruz, but within the context of the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies department, of which I'm an affiliate, because I will not ever friggin' teach a class in the literature department at UC Santa Cruz ever again. I won't even have the course cross-listed. But I'm thinking there is a course to be had on the pedagogy and the scholarly pedagogical and scholarly study of Black romance as a theoretical course, as a practicum, which means I'd have to write a syllabus and do all that stuff. So I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about designing it. I just have to make sure that the university will allow me to do what I want to do. Since I'm emerita, they say, well, but if they will allow me to, I'm going to try the privilege of Margo Hendricks with them at this point. So I'm going to do. So one of the things I want to say before, I got 4 minutes, so I'm going to do something that I love to do. Okay, so first of all, the center is on March 2nd. What time? Oh, it's in the chat. They're doing an evening of remembrance with bell hooks. Okay, so if you know anybody's connection to Santa Cruz, at some point in the 90s, our paths crossed. So I did have a chance to meet Belle and to talk to her through Akasha Gloria Hull, who taught there. And if you're old enough to know Akasha, Gloria Hall. If you don't, you need to read her. And also through Gloria Sandoval and Sherry Moraga and Adrian Rich. There are all this group of people who were poets and writers and thinkers and feminists and amazing individuals when I walked into Santa Cruz in 1991, who I had the privilege of hanging with. So I want to say, do attend this evening of remembrance. I also want to say, Bell Hooks is a very complicated thinker, writer, etc. So no one knows how to do this. The last point I want to say is I am in the company of some amazing contemporary Black romance authors who are in the room now, okay? If you can see their names, screenshot. Just go through and screenshot, okay? Because Kenya Gordy Bell, Tasha Harrison, I don't know if Katrina Jackson's in here. She right now, Katrina's gonna be my contemporary person. DL1, there are Black romance authors in here. I'm sorry, you cannot cut me off yet. I got 3 minutes on my time. I'm in California. I actually got 3 hours. Please, please, please support them. Stand up for them because they are writing Black romance, not always interracial, but sometimes, not always multicultural, but sometimes, but they are definitely always writing Black romance. Buy their books, support them. White authors, if you're an accomplice, you know what it means to write shotgun. That means you purchase everything. You learn these authors' names. You buy their books. I don't care if you never buy anything from me. I don't care that you buy from them. I'm retired. I got an income. All right. I write because I love it. They write because they love it. We do Black romance because we love it. Please support them and stand up to your white counterparts who try to change the narrative. They don't, okay, this is number 2, fucking have the right to do that. They don't. So, okay, that was my Margo from the 1970s Black Panther-ish moment. Thank you all for coming, and I totally appreciate your support of me and standing with me and everything. And thank you, Julie, and thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Catherine, and thank you, everybody who's involved in putting together these amazing moments. So thank you.
Yes, thanks, Margo, and thanks everybody for attending. We'll try to work as quickly as we can next week to get it uploaded to our YouTube channel, and we'll have the recording